Naming and numbering system governed by ICANN still are foundational to the internet's operation. ICANN is still the most institutionally elaborate and historically rich example we have of global governance of the digital economy by a multi-stakeholder institution. And, you know, as people are debating the possible need for new types of governance systems pertaining to new technologies that have come down the pike in recent years, the question of whether ICANN's multi-stakeholder model and experience may offer lessons for other issue areas seems pretty relevant to me. So I think it's very much worth taking stock of ICANN's ecosystem, how it's digested the transition in light of 7 years of experience, and any wider lessons that may apply for internet and digital governance. I could talk a little bit about, as by way of introduction, about the IANA transition and nature of the IANA functions, but looking at the people who are on the call right now, it seems completely irrelevant to do that. So I'm not going to give you a bunch of background about IANA, although we can bring this in as the discussion evolves. But needless to say, the functions associated with IANA, managing the root zone, processing root zone file changes, coordinating global pool of IP and AS numbers, protocol assignments, and so on, were performed by ICANN under contract with the US government for many years. And in 2016, the US government pulled back from that and handed over responsibility to the ICANN community to manage on a multi-stakeholder basis. So we have a very important freestanding global multi-stakeholder governance mechanism that is, I think, of some relevance to the global digital economy going forward. So we're going to talk about that. And to do it, we have a panel of leading personalities from the ICANN sphere. And I should, I guess, maybe say a couple of things about that. ICANN, of course, brings together a wide variety of tribes from industry registries and registrars, resellers, domainers, business users, intellectual property interests, ISPs, government, civil society groups, technical community, all kinds of different groups. So all of which have battled vigorously over endless years, even decades, on a wide variety of issues. So whenever you try to organize an event about ICANN, some people always say, well, why did you include that stakeholder group and not this stakeholder group? I've decided that, you know, with a small panel, it's just impossible to even think about doing that. So I just went with three very interesting people who have represented a range of interests in ICANN. And I think, as will become clear, although all have participated in ICANN for years, they hardly are singing from the same hymnal. Indeed, all of us, including me, have been on different sides of many different issues over the years. So I think there's plenty of grounds for some robust and lively debate. So let me just introduce our three panelists. We have Olga Cavalli coming in from Buenos Aires. Olga is the National Director of Cybersecurity in the Chief of Cabinet of the President of Argentina. And she's a former Undersecretary of Information Technology and advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Argentina. Olga is also, as many of you know her, the co-founder and academic director of the South School on Internet Governance, which runs these large annual governance training capacity building sessions that are attended by hundreds of people from the global South, particularly Latin America. And in ICANN, Olga has served on the Government Advisory Committee for years, including as its vice chair, and has also been a member of the GNSO, the Generic Name Supporting Organization, and the Country Code Name Supporting Organization councils. So she's been involved in many different dimensions of the community. James Gannon is the Vice President of Quality, Trust, and Safety at the PharmaLedger Association, where he manages technology governance for the pharmaceutical industry's first not-for-profit dedicated to patient-centric use of emerging technologies. In ICANN, James is the chair of the board of directors of Public Technical Identifiers, PTI, about which we will be talking more. During the IANA transition, he led the design team focused on continuity of IANA operations, and post-transition, He served on the GNSO Council, representing non-contracted parties, including the private sector, on the Customer Standing Committee, which is the body responsible for overseeing the IANA functions. And lastly, Milton Mueller is professor at Georgia Institute of Technology's School of Public Policy and director of the school's Internet Governance Project. He's the author of 7 books and many journal articles, reports, blogs, etc. on internet governance. And in ICANN, he has been involved from the beginning in debates on the organization structure and operation, and co-initiated the creation of the Civil Society Coalition within the GNSO, the non-commercial user constituency, and served in various positions, including on the IANA Stewardship Coordination Group. I mean, maybe I should also say, by way of disclosure, that I too was involved in ICANN for a decade and served on the GNSO Council for 2 terms and 3 years as the chair of the Civil Society Coalition in GNSO, and also on the nominating committee and the board of the European at-large organization and so on. So we are all people who have been involved a lot in ICANN, but yet have very diverse views about ICANN and its role in the larger internet governance ecosystem. And I think as we'll see as the conversation goes, the views that we have are fairly diverse. So I have basically in the announcement listed 5 broad topical areas that I thought we could talk about a bit. The IANA transition's consequences geopolitically, the implementation of the transition and the accountability framework, what we've learned over the past 7 years since the transition in 2016, ways in which independence of ICANN from the US government have affected ICANN's ability to meet new challenges in the environment, ICANN's role and engagement in the wider global internet governance ecosystem, and lessons from ICANN's experience with regard to multi-stakeholder cooperation in other arenas. So I think these are 5 basic questions, and they're focused really on the sort of political and institutional types of questions that are interested to me as a governance person. So obviously they're not the questions that somebody who's involved in the domain or segment of the business community would necessarily think are the most important, et cetera. I recognize that. That we're focusing less here on the business aspects and more on the institutional aspects, I guess, today. So that's my brief introduction. Let me go then to our panel and start by talking about the geopolitical and institutional consequences of the IANA transition in 2016. And so I think we've got good people to ask about this. So a question I would start with is, you know, those of us who were around back then, who are internet governance veterans, recall that for years, ICANN's relationship to the US government was a central flashpoint of debate in global internet governance circles. And there were demands by many developing countries and non-democratic countries for some sort of intergovernmental control over ICANN, or indeed for ICANN to be replaced by intergovernmental mechanisms. And all these were deeply intertwined with the whole question of the IANA functions being performed under contract with the US government. So the Obama administration severed that tie, and the question is, given that that was done, are the governments and others that were unhappy back then, prior to the transition, are they now happy with, or at least resigned to, ICANN's role in management of IANA functions and its larger relationship to the internet governance environment? Is ICANN free and clear, as some people seem to think, of concerns about intergovernmental power plays and so on? Or should we think that the recurrent proposals from Russia and others for intergovernmental control are still, in UN settings, are still very much live issues? I mean, so the geopolitics I think is a good place to start with thinking about this. And let me turn to our panel to try to get some initial conversation about that. How about Olga? Why don't maybe you could start, since you were very involved with the Government Advisory Committee and very tightly connected to the people that were raising concerns. Please give us your...
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for inviting me. Always a pleasure trying to contribute with your activities. And hello, all friends that I haven't seen some of you in a while, and I hope to see you again after this break with the pandemic. Well, at that time of the IANA transition, I was a member of the GAC representing my country, Argentina, and I was vice chair. What I see two sides of this issue. I think it was a very interesting multi-stakeholder process and an achievement of a good outcome, which in general, I think it was very positive for the whole community. From the governmental perspective, especially from a developing country perspective, I would say that it was somehow disappointing, the general mistrust that we felt through all the process. So there was this idea that governments were going to behave in a bad manner in the new structure. And so there was, not going into details, the carve out, so the board could reject in an easier way the advice from the governmental advisory committee. And there was this several stress tests that they were limiting the role of governments within the multi-stakeholder infrastructure of ICANN. That was felt by several governments as a mistrust feeling. That was not fair. I mean, not all the countries in the world behave the same way. And with some countries, we felt that we were treated in the same way with this kind of mistrust. And but in general, I think it was an interesting process. But from the governmental perspective, I think it was somehow a missing opportunity. If you see the involvement of governments in the GAC after the IANA transition, it's lower. So the turnover of the GAC representative is very high. Many countries are not sending representatives or sending representatives of not higher a hierarchy in their structure, and many other meetings are capturing attention from governments, like industry meetings, like the Barcelona Mobile, for example. Argentina sends a big delegation with people from private sector, governments, academia. ITU is changing. ITU is changing a lot, and for example, our government is very much involved with this Partners to Connect initiative, which is multi-stakeholder, and they have a new leadership. So what I see is a shift in the interest of governments in participating more in other industry-led meetings or United Nations, like the Global Digital Compact process and WSIS process, than in ICANN. I see ICANN doing well in all the technical aspects, but very much focused on in that community. And I don't see them looking to the future. I don't see any group within ICANN thinking about what will happen with artificial intelligence or blockchain, or how that will impact the DNS system. And I will stop here. Thank you, Bill, for inviting me.
Okay, thanks. So just to clarify, Olga, so empirically, it is evident that there's been a drop-off in engagement, though, over the past
that's I'm not in the GAC anymore because I don't work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs since 2 years so far. But I see, I am in permanent contact with them. And when I go to ICANN meetings where I'm engaged as an academic now in the GNSO and now in the CCNSO, I'm in contact with many friends in the GAC. And I see that there was no election for the GAC chair. It was only one candidate, and they say, okay, fine. And before, it was a big issue. You can remember, I was a candidate, and there was other candidates, and there was a lot of interest in that election. And now it's just there's one candidate, and that's fine. So that talks about interest.
Okay, Milton, I'm sure you lament the erosion of government engagement in ICANN. So maybe you could share.
Sure. So I am actually writing a book about the whole transition process. It's kind of completing the trilogy that I've developed, starting with ruling the root, then networks and states, and now the IANA transition. So some of you have been interviewed by me, and some of you will be interviewed by me about this, including you, Olga. But I think the thing that strikes me with that historical perspective is that ICANN was started with a very particular vision as to what kind of governance we wanted. And it was based on this idea of a global internet community that was not nation states, right? And the GAC was kind of this quarantined element that was supposed to give advice kind of in a very vague consultative sense in the early days. And by the way, nobody talked about multi-stakeholderism or multi-stakeholder governance for the first 5-6 years of when ICANN was founded. It was about private sector, non-governmental governance, right? And of course, the World Summit changed all that. And gradually, governments became kind of a stakeholder. But I think the big problem with ICANN from the beginning, and what made the transition significant, was the issue of accountability. That is to say, we were creating this completely new institutional structure out of thin air, and it was making important decisions, policy decisions as well as board decisions about its own governance as an organization. And there was simply a vacuum regarding to who this entity was accountable. We experimented with elections. We could get into that debate, but I think the initial board simply did not want to be accountable to a membership. And so we had this huge accountability vacuum. And if you review the history, it's just incredible how we went back and forth on this and how many problems and issues arose because of that lack of accountability. And so the US became the default accountability check. And the reason the US hung on to control for so long was not because the US got some big geopolitical advantage out of it, and not because we were upholding American values of free speech or anything like that, and not because we were afraid the Russians or the Chinese would take it over if we left. We were in there, the US government was in there, I should say, because we needed some kind of fundamental accountability. And so it was entirely appropriate that after, when we thought, okay, the US government's going to get out, when the government decided it was going to get out, that we should have to solve the accountability issue at the same time. And so we went through this massive bylaw change and did indeed try to create a system, a mechanism for accountability that involved the global internet community. Now, from my point of view, governments are far more empowered now than they were at the origin of ICANN, because they are considered an AC within the empowered community. The fact that they're not so interested in exercising that power now probably has to do with the fact that the policy issues that are being considered by ICANN, notably new TLDs, are fairly minor, right? So, but I'll leave it at that. And I just think that governments may indeed be less interested now, but the structure of ICANN has empowered them. They've made them part of the empowered community. They have more power than they were meant to have in the original design of ICANN. And I think the US is, pretty much in the place it should be. That is, it's one member of the GAC.
So we have one view that governments are more influential and one that governments are less influential. So I think that's dialectical. James, from the standpoint of somebody who's involved with public technical identifiers, obviously as the chair, I mean, speaking for yourself, of course, by the way, I should say you are not speaking on behalf of any organization or process you're involved with. The governmental side of this, have you guys noticed any change or any relevance since the transition?
And I'm actually going to step back a little bit. Before my time at PTI, I had the the opportunity to serve on two of the key accountability mechanisms that we designed during the IANA transition. So the first was the CSC, which is essentially the operational oversight of IANA, on a monthly basis. And also I served on the IANA functions review, which is again a more big picture strategic view. And I'll have to agree with Olga that, post-transition, we had designed these things, but then we saw a massive drop-off in governmental participation in both of those key accountability mechanisms that we put a lot of time and effort into designing and operating. And we had very little participation in both of those from governments. I think to Milton's point, some of it is, yes, it's a different policy area that is, the focus has shifted. I think it's interesting to see, though, that I think there's probably less focus on the true technical mission piece, which is what the IANA functions really underplay. And to be honest, that's boring from a governance point of view. It's not a policy objective for an SLA to be met 99.5% of every single month. So from a governmental point of view, it's both a success and maybe a bit of a failure that it's successful that we designed a accountability mechanism that was so focused on the actual mission of ICANN, which is to deliver the IANA functions. And, those functions are delivered very well. This was one of the key things is throughout the transition, those SLAs that we designed, they were implemented and they've been met almost entirely every single month ever since then. I think we've had 5 months in the entirety of those 6-7 years that those SLAs have not been met. And we've actually determined that most of the times those SLAs were not met were outside of PTI's actual control. So it is interesting, though, that we designed these mechanisms that almost encourage less participation from folks on the governmental side because we made it a little bit boring from a governance point of view.
So that being the case, then, if we've got this kind of situation where government's level of engagement and interest around involvement in ICANN activities is sort of withering away, but does that constitute then does that mean that the transition was a success in terms of depoliticizing permanently the fundamentals around ICANN, and that ICANN its position in the ecosystem is unassailable, stable, and not to be threatened by Russian proposals to replace it and things like that? I mean, what's our net takeaway in terms of 7 years experience?
Well, my net takeaway is that, yes, it was successful in depoliticizing the IANA functions. However, there are the policymaking functions, particularly for the DNS, which remain somewhat political. Those remain a matter of engagement. And there are some other issues which the .org sale situation is an interesting case of how ICANN stumbled into a policy decision regarding, the ownership requirements. So basically, ICANN is, they always like to say we're not a regulator, but they are a private sector government agency for the domain name industry in terms of setting policy and enforcing it through contracts. The questions about ownership and who you license to be a registrar and a registry are still significant policy issues. I do agree with you, Bill, with your suggestion that post-transition, there's very little for the rest of the world to complain about in terms of trying to move the ICANN functions to another entity. And we saw a very good exercise of ICANN's proper role when the Ukraine delegation asked for ICANN to get involved in foreign policy matters and to sanction or remove Russian top-level domains from the root. I think that was a good example of how the whole experiment was successful in depoliticizing the situation.
Mm-hmm. Olga, do you have something on this?
Yeah, and I think Milton brought a very interesting point. One of the issues that may capture the attention from many countries was the new GTLD process started in 2012, and And that for me was a very interesting process, which somehow was another missing opportunity to more engagement with governments. So many countries from Latin America were interested in the process because of the Amazon and the Patagonia and other governments as well from Belgium and other countries. And whether I think that laws has to be respected, and I'm an engineer, not a lawyer, so you may disagree with me. And intellectual property regulations are to be respected. I think that ICANN missed an opportunity to mediate in between parties. And so there was a big disappointment from many governments, especially in Latin America. And there's a part that also depends on governments that was not perhaps very well managed, but that's Argentina is not an Amazonian country. But I think that was also a missing opportunity. And that, as you can see, many governments stopped participating or getting involved after that. We have to see what will happen with the next round. I think that's a new opportunity. After the first round, me and some countries from Latin America, we started to try to find a way to protect geographic names, and we organized a working group and then a work track in all that process. I was not very, very happy with the outcome because in general, all the intellectual property focuses prevails, which I understand, but there should be some space for negotiation or for changing that perspective. But we'll see what happens. So that I see another reason that maybe some governments stopped paying attention to ICANN.
Okay. Well, it's interesting to note the divergence, though. I mean, on the one hand, I mean, within ICANN government engagement maybe atrophying a bit. Within the UN environment, you still get periodically lots of proposals from governments that would very much impinge on what ICANN is doing, sometimes quite strongly. And if you talk to people, I mean, the 20 years I was in Geneva hanging around the UN, you talk to a lot of developing country representatives, and frankly, if there was a proposal to shift the whole system to a different model that they thought could be accepted, they would go for it in a second. So we're in a kind of funny equilibrium here, where the situation's locked in, but the levels of happiness about it are variable.
But I think that's the critical point, Bill, is that the whole creation of ICANN was an attempt to not be part of an intergovernmental system. Mm-hmm. And so much of what Olga says, or what many people in the GAC say, is sort of like, why isn't ICANN more like an intergovernmental organization? Mm-hmm. And I think the answer to that is we don't want it to be. The global internet community is trying to be out of the sovereign system and into a more cooperative, globalized environment in which you do not have governments using the internet infrastructure for their own national interests, but they're trying to create a global public interest.
Right.
Can I correct something? I never said that I think that ICANN should be an intergovernmental organization, and never was said from my government. We are not in that group of countries, which I understand your concern, Milton, and I share the concerns with you. But I also understand that the infrastructure where ICANN is based within the United States has some limitations in relation with the participation of governments. And we understand that. What I say is that sometimes you don't need to change the structure, but you have to be somehow more flexible and trying to mediate. So you capture the attention, because when you talk about names that are related with mountains, rivers, and regions, that's not technical. That's something related with community, with geography, with the feeling of sovereignty, and that you're going into another stage. So there I see a missing opportunity, but I agree, and I never said that I wanted to be an intergovernmental organization, which I like ICANN very much, you know that.
Right. Thanks, Olga. And I didn't mean to prompt a relitigation of the Amazon case. I was only just raising the larger question. I did and I'll move on to another question, but just to say, I recently taught a capacity building course for a group of developing country government people, a couple dozen from around the world. And to a person, they all worked in ministries where the attitude was, ICANN's that American thing. Still, that it's controlled by American corporations. We have no say, we have no interest. And I just thought, wow, that's breathtaking to still be hearing this 20 years after WSIS, but okay.
And just before we move on, Bill, one last point,
sure,
because I don't want it to be, I wanted to be clear that like, I think ICANN's engagement in certain forums has changed as well. So like, I know, Olga, you mentioned, there's a whole new world out there that ICANN may not be paying attention to, blockchain, AI, quantum computing, etc. I think ICANN's engagement is not the same as it used to be. I think ICANN's engagement in those fora now is very technical. So, for example, we have Octo Papers, the Office of the CTO at ICANN, writes extremely detailed technical research papers rather than maybe the more socio-political engagement that had happened previously. So I think it's a shift in how the organization operates in the ecosystem as well that's happened since the transition.
Right. What would do we want ICANN to say anything about AI? I mean, seriously, how is that part of their mission?
Can we come back to this question of engagement in the larger ecosystem later, just to round off first the discussion of the mechanisms within ICANN? I mean, I'd like to hear some thoughts from people, first of all, about how independence from the US government has affected ICANN's operations, if at all, because it's an interesting situation. I mean, we've established, on the one hand, public technical identifiers to have this role vis-a-vis the performance of the IANA function, and we have these accountability mechanisms that are established with the empowered community, which are very unique and interesting. And so I think it's worth talking just a little bit of, how's it going with these things? I mean, with the benefit of experience, of 7 years experience, have we seen any change, enhancement in the capacity of ICANN, the org, the community, the entire ecosystem to manage itself effectively? Are things on us? Is the institution stronger than before in some really noticeable ways? I'd like to just get an internal look for a second on how implementation of all this is going. For example, with the PTI, James, I mean, you're chairing the board. In terms of operational challenges, political challenges, other kinds of challenges you guys are facing, whether the institutional mechanisms that we have are optimal, what are the kind of issues that you see?
Yeah, so speaking from a very operational point of view, the transition was seamless. There was zero impact on IANA's customers from the IANA transition. And that's not just an educated guess. Like, we have metrics and data that were generated as SLAs during the transition to back that up. And it's also backed up with the annual IANA customer survey that we see, again, high levels of satisfaction throughout all three of the communities that we serve. On the improvements that I think that has brought, I think it has been measurable. So number one, I think, is there was a lot of work done on implementing the SLAs. So these are, key KPIs across 100 plus areas of the IANA functions on how does IANA operate on a daily basis? Is it working as per a set of defined metrics? And that's something that wasn't in place before. And I think, from an operational point of view and from a board perspective, a strategic oversight piece, it's very key to be able to have that data. There's actually a live dashboard that everybody can just go to and see the current performance of the IANA functions. So that was, I think, was a key element in the oversight change. It went from a more contractual oversight to a real live operational oversight. And then in terms of the evolution of the IANA itself within ICANN, yes, there was organizational changes. There was some internal governance changes that needed to happen. People needed to move their employer of record. They're still sitting in the same seat doing the same job, but they technically have a new employer. That took some time to implement. But like 7 years in now, we're a clean slate. It's really worked as we intended it to do. And that's a real testament to the amount of work that was put in during the transition. Usually when you try and design something this large and this complex in a very compressed period of time, it usually doesn't work out as intended. And in this case, it did. All of the processes, all of the accountability mechanisms, all worked as intended. And from an operational point of view, it really was seamless and there really was no impact. Politically, that's a bigger picture for more of the ICANN side of the house. But from an operational IANA/PTI perspective, it really worked as intended.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Milton.
Yeah. So let's differentiate now between the IANA reform and the policy-making reform within ICANN. So I agree with everything that James said about the PTI story. The idea was we would make PTI accountable because, number one, they have to contract with each of the stewards of the registry system, the addresses, the names, and the numbers, and they can lose that contract if they misbehave, although that's a lot less clean of a system than I would have preferred, but they did, in fact, legally separate PTI from ICANN.org. If you look at the policymaking side, you still find a lot of politics, and you find a somewhat uneven record regarding the success of the transition. So let's talk first about the success with respect to the GDPR. It was long and somewhat painful, but I cannot imagine ICANN responding as appropriately as it did to the implementation of the GDPR in 2018 had it still been under US control. People don't realize how much political pressure via the mechanism of the IANA contract and the supervision of the Commerce Department affected ICANN's policy decisions when it came to things like the GDPR and intellectual property in various aspects of policymaking. So that's one, I think, important success. I do think that under CEO Joran Marby, ICANN was a bit timid. I'm not sure that Joran, hope this doesn't get me into trouble, I'm not sure he fully understood and was committed to the idea of a private sector-based governance organization, and it's still sort of viewed, he either wanted ICANN to be more governmental or was a little bit intimidated by governments, particularly the European Union. But in general, he did the right thing. He got us, this adjustment of the WHOIS system in a way that conformed to global privacy requirements. And they did it, in a very strange and slow way, but it got done. Now, what do I consider to be the lack of success? Well, that has to do with the intervention of the California Attorney General in the .org controversy. So here was a situation, again, in which ICANN had to make an important policy decision about the transfer of ownership of .org. And instead of making it, the board was very intimidated, and they let the California Attorney General got lobbied by essentially American policy-oriented groups. And he intervened and basically said, I'm going to come after you if you don't make the decision that I think is right. And that is an example of governmental intervention, again, from the United States, not from Russia or China. Really just totally influencing the board decision of ICANN, I think, in that case. Now, they might have made the same decision anyway, but nobody really knows because they hemmed and hawed and they dragged their feet and didn't indicate on what basis they were going to make a decision because they were intimidated by the politics. So I consider that to be not such a good record. And it remains to be seen going forward how they handle controversial policy issues and the influence of governments.
Okay, so the GDPR presents a case where the transition did matter in terms of the capacity of ICANN to respond to a new challenge and the independence. And whereas with the PTI operations, we're saying there's not much real difference in terms of the way it's operating, right?
Well, there was a difference. The California Attorney General had never intervened before. It had always been the Commerce Department or Congress pressuring ICANN, and now it was California.
Right.
So in some ways you could say, that to the Brazilians or people who thought that its location in the United States created imbalance in political influence, and we would all say, no, it's just has to be incorporated somewhere, which of course is correct. But the policy is supposed to be made by the organization, which is internationally representative. Well, here's a case in which a state attorney general had outsized influence on what ICANN did.
Right. Olga, any thoughts, particularly with regard to the IANA functions?
I think that what James commented about PTI is perfectly fine. I totally agree. What I see from the outside, I'm a technical person. I have no idea what is happening, and I would like to know more, to be more communicative. That should be more open. It is difficult at the national level to get involved because this has to be with the regional internet registry and other organizations, and has nothing to do with the national structure. But it could be good to have more information about what they are doing. What Milton said about the .org was a clear example that the jurisdictional issue matters, and it was really, for me and from others, very impacting, because it was really not expected that ICANN could be really influenced in that way, and it showed somehow something that many countries have been talking about. But talking about the GDPR, we were just saying a minute ago, what would it matter? Artificial intelligence or fake news or hate speech influence ICANN? Somehow, some regulations may have an impact. So I think that there should be someone or a small group or someone thinking about strategically the future or the impact of regulations developed maybe in the European Union or in the States or in other countries that could have an impact in the domain system, as GDPR did. So this is why I think that I don't see that strategic view to the present and the future in ICANN. I see the silo structure looking at their own issues that I follow at large, and so now, and I follow other groups from afar. I don't see that happening, and it may have an impact in internet, in ICANN, sorry.
Right.
And just a quick 2-second response. So here's actually another advantage that I didn't think about. So amusingly, I literally flew in the other day from our board strategic workshop from PTI, and Olga, to your point about, the transparency and maybe that external facing element of IANA that wasn't there traditionally, that's actually a topic that came up at our workshop, and it's something that we're going to put on our strategic plan. And I think that reflects a bit of the wider scope of independent operations that IANA and PTI now has, that it's its own thing and the board sets its own strategy. We don't always need to link up to exactly what ICANN is doing, because we have different needs. ICANN, as everybody's saying, has a wider scope, a lot more of a political element. IANA is very technically focused, which is correct and right. But within our scope, then we have the ability, okay, let's do some more external engagement. Let's do some more outreach. Let's do some more training and development and capacity building. Now that we are our own thing to decide that for ourselves, we have that ability to do that. Whereas traditionally in the past, that really wasn't on the cards because it mightn't have fit into the broader picture that was going on.
Right. But wasn't the name PTI selected for its lack of transparency? It seems to me like this is a way like we're going to have public technical identifiers is going to manage the Internet Assigned Name Authority function. This is like a great way to make people pass out and not pay attention to what you're doing.
As Milton just put in the chat, PTI originally stood for post-transition IANA,
right.
And due to the timelines involved, that was never renamed in our documentation. So thus a backronym of something had to be created to fit PTI to calling the IANA legal entity something.
Talk about path dependence. Why don't we turn to the accountability thing briefly, and then we'll just do a last sort of round around multi-stakeholder and engagement with the ecosystem and open it up because we've got lots of interesting people in the room with us. But just on the accountability stuff, okay, we're saying that the overall, the functioning and the IANA functions, not a substantial change, smooth transition, post transition, et cetera. Yeah, that's redundant. What about the accountability side? Obviously, there's been no exercising of the community powers yet in any way, but has the mechanisms that have been put in place, proved to be sufficient so far in managing relationships between states and different stakeholder groups, between the org, the board, the community, with ensuring some level of responsiveness or accountability to parties outside of the ICANN ecosystem? How is the accountability mechanism that so many people worked on so hard for a couple of years? How is it working with the benefit of 7 years experience? Milton.
The basic empowered community concept has not really been put to the test yet. I personally was a little bit disappointed with the outcome because, again, I think it essentially treated SOs and ACs on the same level. And it said, if you can get 3 of the 5 SOACs to agree on some major problem that has happened and needs to be redressed, for example, firing the board or recalling a board member, then you have some accountability. The problem with that is that within the internal politics of ICANN, and again, this is not going to win me any friends, but I think the at-large advisory committee is not a serious organization in terms of its accountability and representation. It is fundamentally an internal part of ICANN, funded by ICANN and supported by ICANN org. And during the transition process, they consistently, repeatedly took the same position as the ICANN organization and in order to sort of protect it from being accountable. And then the GAC is another advisory committee that's been put on the same level as the GNSO and the ASO and the the IETF really. And again, that's kind of problematic if you think, let's suppose that one of the stress tests you're concerned about is the idea that ICANN will be sort of subordinated to geopolitical concerns of governments. Then, an alliance of ALAC and GAC, which is something that happened consistently during the transition process, could block any accountability process. So I'm not too happy with that. Now, one of the good things that did happen is I think that the GAC has to have consensus, that is to say unanimity among its members before they can produce a policy. So we don't have a one country, one vote system going on there, which is good. But I still think that the role of the GAC and of ALAC in the accountability process is a bit problematic. But the political realities dictated that the people who were participating in the process were going to make sure that they were represented in the key decision-making roles when the process was finished. So that's pretty much what happened.
Okay, I think you didn't probably make yourself any friends there, but that's
what a surprise.
That's not new, Milton, so that's okay. So Olga, what do you think? ALAC and GAC?
I'm not talking about ALAC. I have a lot of friends there, so I won't go into that.
Okay, so the position of GAC.
But I see some comments from Greg in the chat, which are very interesting.
And the requirement for unanimity, great thing.
The thing with the vote in the GAC was an issue of a long discussion within the GAC. There are pros and cons for that. The thing with the consensus is that if one or few governments can can block any kind of agreement with the majority, which it's a long discussion in the GAC, and it was never solved. I think that I will repeat again what I said at the beginning. There was this feeling of mistrust against government, which for some of us was very disappointing. Like all of us will really behave as a bad actor, and that is not the feeling that we had. There may be some countries, but not all of us were put in the same place. And but it turned out to be that way. I think that the whole system has not been tested, as you have said recently. Maybe it's like security, you know, when everything is secure, nothing happens. So maybe it's because the system is so good and it works so well that it has not been tested. We will see. So that's my comment for the moment.
Okay.
And to give a slight counterpoint to Milton, and I'll preface this with, I'm a compliance guy, right? So my day job is compliance. And I would say that we do actually test the accountability mechanisms that we put in place. We test them every single month. Mm-hmm. You know, we have so many monthly meetings that people are sitting in the background doing the quiet, non-sexy work to make sure that every single month we're getting reports, both from PTI and from other areas of ICANN, which go through the process of review and approval by the community. We've undergone fundamental bylaw changes since we did the transition, which was another key accountability mechanism that we put in place. You know, I shepherded one of those through the process when I was on the CSC, and that was the EC may be quiet on a month-to-month basis, but I can tell you there was a lot of meetings and a lot of debate and challenge to us as the proposers of that fundamental bylaw change. Mm-hmm. Even though it was a very administrative technical one, the community stood up and went, hey, this is one of these accountability mechanisms we did. We're going to put a lot of time and effort into making sure this happens. And the last big one is every single year we go through the rejection action period for the budget. And that's another huge mechanism that we put in place, is that the community can turn around to ICANN and say, either for the IANA budget specifically or for the overall ICANN budget, no, we disagree. Mm-hmm. And every single year, the EC has sat down and gone through that process. Our design of those governance structures was by definition boring. And this comes back to the point I was making earlier, is we've made it so that this is background work. It's quiet. It's not big and flashy. But I would say they really are working, and we test them every single year in various aspects. So like, that's a success. I think the fact that we haven't used the big picture ones, I agree. Obviously that's something, but we designed those to be the exception rather than the rule.
I totally agree with what James is saying there. I'm sorry if I didn't make that distinction between there were a lot of really good procedural accountability reforms as part of this. And James is in the middle of them, so he sees them in operation. But I was indeed talking more about, like, did we ever fire the entire board? Did we ever recall a board member? Did we reverse a decision? Those are the big picture ones, and hopefully those never have to be invoked, right? So I think it's great that James made this point, that there are mechanisms that are going on a daily basis, and those are vast improvements on what was happening before.
Okay. Let me turn to the last question, and then we'll try and open it up and get some engagement from the other people that are here. This is speaking to the ICANN's involvement in the larger ecosystem, and it's the extent to which ICANN's experience, its multi-stakeholder model, is generalizable and relevant and something that can be built out. Many of us participated in the construction of this whole multi-stakeholder discourse in enterprise over the past years. It was something, whether in IGF or WSIS or ICANN or other settings, that people put a lot of energy into trying to think about and trying to tweak and improve. And indeed, we had the whole kind of notion emerge of multi-stakeholder as an ism, which Larry Stricking, I know, doesn't think is a good term. But I mean, there was a lot of commitment to the idea. And there was a lot of people who thought that the ICANN model perhaps could be applied elsewhere in the world. I mean, you remember former CEO Cavalli used to say that the world needs lots of different little ICANNs, right, to tackle privacy, to tackle content moderation, whatever the big new issues are that could develop these kinds of structures. So it's worth maybe thinking about, how effective the mechanism seems to be, how durable it seems to be, whether there's anything that could be learned from it for the larger community or for a larger ecosystem of digital and internet governance issues that's emerging today. And also, if you have any thoughts about the question that was raised earlier in the conversation about ICANN's engagement in that larger ecosystem. I mean, we did have a period under FATI where, you had the strategy panels and the high-level panel chaired by President Ilves and the Net Mondial Initiative, all the One Net Coalition, all that activity. And then there was this big retrenchment after 2016 with the new bylaws and keep ICANN's head down, stick to the knitting. Now we're moving towards a new CEO. It's worth thinking about what kind of attributes you want there. So the questions of how ICANN relates to the larger ecosystem, how it engages, and whether its model is relevant or could be learned from in other settings, I think is something that just generally I'd like to get some feedback from people. Who would like to go first? Olga, shoot.
Thank you, Bill. Very good question. I've been following ICANN for 13 years. I have seen efforts in trying to improve the multi-stakeholder model, but I think still stuck in this silo structure. The structure of the meeting has changed, which is good, but these multi-participation panels are informative, I would say. It's okay that many people are participating. They are not very interactive as I would like, and they have no impact in the structure or in the policy development process or in the processes of each ISO on NC. As far as I can see, I think that the most multi-stakeholder structure is the GNSO and at the board, but the rest is it's very much in the same interest of the group and the same people participating with the same or civil society or government or CCNSO participation. So I said this many times, I don't see that as a very good multi-stakeholder model. I don't see the interaction. I don't see the interaction in between silos improving. I think there were efforts, but I still think there's a lack. I don't think this is happening in the technical aspects. I think this is working very well. But as I said, I don't get much information about that. That would be me being a technical person. I would appreciate to be more involved with that processes, at least to be informed.
It's interesting to talk about the GNSO as a multi-stakeholder process because
it is.
Right.
It has representation. Lacking governments, everyone is there.
How many times have I heard people say that ICANN makes all its decisions by consensus? And I'm thinking, years voting in the GNSO Council. So I never understood the characterization that in multi-stakeholder, you don't do any of the old things and it's all kumbaya, we hum together. Anyway, Milton, go ahead.
Right. So the question of how far can you take the so-called multi-stakeholder governance model is a very interesting one. And I think what I have been telling people for years, and nobody seems to get, is that the reason we have global private sector-led governance from ICANN is because we're dealing with something that requires global coordination, and we have a point of leverage through which governance can take place, namely entry into the root or into the registries that are governed by ICANN. And unless you have that, for example, if you're talking about something like privacy regulation or data protection regulation, you do not have a single point of leverage for a global multi-stakeholder policy-making organization to take. Instead, you have 200 national governments making laws, and therefore it's highly unlikely that privacy would ever, or an issue like privacy would ever be somehow fit into the same model. Now, there are cases, and I'm going to, it's another one where we're doing some research here at the Internet Governance Project. It's the the PKI infrastructure for the web, where you do have self-governance among the industry players. It's sort of what I think closer to what ICANN, what the Commerce Department thought it was going to get when it created ICANN. That is to say, really direct stakeholders participating in governance. It's very, it creates rules. It creates what they call baseline requirements that are governing the way certificate authorities behave, and all with the goal of creating compatibility and security in internet internet processes. And that system, I think, works very well. It's a very interesting case, but it's not multi-stakeholder in the sense that they say, like ICANN, everybody come, and we don't care, whether you have any real economic stake in this. Your ideas are just as good as the certificate authorities or browser manufacturers as to what the policy should be. The governance regime is confined to direct economic stakeholders. And I think that's one of the reasons it works so well and is not quite as messy as ICANN.
I think as well, there's two ways to look at it. You can look at it as the reuse of the exact ICANN model versus the reuse of certain principles and concepts that came up through the ICANN model. Like if you look at it more from a principle and concept point of view, there is a lot of reuse of the model. There's a lot of reuse in the model in the decentralized and Web3 space. There's a lot of emerging use of the model at the open source community, particularly around regulated open source. My own employer included, we've taken a lot of the principles of multi-stakeholder policy development and integrated them into how we operate as an organization. And we see that in our partner organization as well. So it's not necessarily about, does the model exactly translate to something else? It's, are there concepts and fundamentals that have been created through those years of experience that others will look at and go, yes, there's pieces of that that are going to apply. And I think if you look at it in that way, there is much more implication of it.
I have to say, there's a lot of conversation about establishing new kinds of multi-stakeholder mechanisms. For example, the UN Global Digital Compact, if you read all the stuff that they're doing under Guterres, it's all about multi-stakeholder, this, that, and the other, but it's multi-stakeholder participation in the dialogue. The decisions remain governmental.
Right.
And it seems to me that the model that we've moved toward, in most cases, as far as I could tell, is really more intergovernmental plus than it is multi-stakeholder. I mean, even the ITU now calls itself a multi-stakeholder institution. But, there's a difference between whether people can speak in a meeting and submit a document, and whether they can participate in actual decision-making. And there aren't a lot of really strong cases where that happens in the digital environment. Maybe PKI is one, but ICANN, the RARs.
I think as well, it depends on the frame in which you're looking at the question. So if you're looking at the implementation of it in other legacy large institutions, yes, fully agree. But I think if you look more in the pure technical space, there is a lot of reuse. It's whether you're looking at whether it's changing existing models or whether it's being served as a foundation for new models in new institutions that are being built. I think that changes very much the level of use. And you don't have, look at the Web3 space. You don't have that, single source of voting or single source of decision making. It is entirely multi-stakeholder at its core.
Mm-hmm. So how should, and then I'm going to stop it. How should ICANN engage in the environment going forward? Do we believe that the current model is perfectly calibrated in terms of its engagement in the wider internet governance ecosystem, and ICANN should just keep its head down, stick to its knitting? Or there are those who say global internet governance faces all these challenges, and we need to have more coordination among the ISTAR organizations, more leadership, more whatever, if not a return to Fadiism, but some further level of engagement. And this is perhaps relevant to selection of a new CEO. So just curious, Any thoughts about that question?
Yeah, so I think there are important ways in which ICANN could be expanding and relating to the new ecosystem, particularly leveraging its capabilities as a registry, right? So, for example, I think at one point Google was talking about certain kinds of privacy enhancing capabilities that it was going to put into its browser, and that could have benefited from having a registry that would make it interoperable with other browsers. And that would lead to a conversation about should the IANA be expanded to manage that registry because it is global and requires global cooperation, and it has already a policy structure for handling that. That would be a good example of how it could get involved. Some of the grander issues of internet government that are really sort of public policy issues where there is no central registry, I think ICANN has no business in those and should stick to its knitting.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I agree somehow with Milton. I agree. What I see now is staff participating in different meetings and reporting perhaps to the community, which is fine, but perhaps more involvement about key representatives from different SOs and ACs in those meetings could help in bringing that information into the different silos that have discussions within ICANN. But I agree with Milton. I don't see ICANN in being coordinating with other ISTAR. They did that once, and I think it didn't have a big impact for the moment.
Wow, we finally found a point of convergence between Olga and Milton. This is great. James.
And this is probably my turn to get in a bit of trouble. So I fully agree with Milton. So the IANA's role is to coordinate unique identifiers on the internet. Traditionally, that's been the three communities that we have always served. In the future, that can be more than those communities. And, you know, just on a very personal note, not speaking on behalf of PTI or anything else, I would love to see those conversations starting. You know, we are the registry operator for a number of different type of registries. We have so many years of experience of doing this at full internet scale. There's a lot of learnings there, you know, so even separate to the let's say the bigger picture governance learnings that ICANN as a community can share with the world, we also have a huge amount of technical expertise that we're not really great at sharing and not really great at tooting our own horn and saying, yeah, we are really good at this, learn from us. And I really would love to see us do more of that in the future.
Would you say, James, that there's some risk that ICANN could become a bit protective or protectionist regarding, for example, the way it's related to the Ethereum namespace had some overtones to my mind of sort of protectionism, like we don't want a competing namespace. I think, again, in terms of how ICANN relates to the broader system, they should have a more innovative and open attitude to those sorts of things. But what do you think about that?
I think in the broad picture, ICANN and IANA should be a positive contributor. We have a mission to, at an element, be protective. You know, there must be one root. But where we have good actors in the space who are not looking to replace that element, we should be positively approached by them and positively engage in return. You know,
what if there was a new technology that actually did threaten to replace DNS?
In that case, then I think ICANN has to protect its turf. You know, to be clear, you know, I think we have a mission. We're bound by the mission that's in the bylaws, you know, both the PTI bylaws and the ICANN bylaws. And our job is to protect the SSR of the global unique root. ICANN can engage in those communities when there are alternatives presented, and it should do things like the Octo papers that it does. It should do an objective analysis of these things, but it's not in ICANN's mission as the steward of the IANA functions as we created to go off and create a replacement for them. If others want to go do that in other spaces, sure.
What about an interconnection agreement with a new namespace that might eventually lead to elimination of DNS, or let's say the deprecation, as they say, of DNS.
And this is where I would like potentially to see more constructive engagement. The ENS model, for example, where they want to be a value add to the DNS route. They don't want to replace the DNS route. They want to be a value add to it. I think in those scenarios, and this is probably where I'm going to get into trouble, I think we should be constructively engaging with those stakeholders.
It hasn't been perceived that way all the time. Okay, listen, this has been great. I think we should open it up and see if any of the other folks that are here would like to get in on some of the broad themes that we've discussed, the three, the sort of geopolitics around what happened with the transition, the way it's been implemented with the accountability and PTI mechanisms, and the larger questions of the scalability of the model of internet governance and ICANN's engagement. Anything there that anybody would like to speak to? We have people here who are centrally involved in the transition, who certainly could offer some perspective should they want to. Anybody want to, is it going to be pulling teeth here, maybe? What do we got? Ellie, would you like to say anything? I know you joined late.
I'm saying hello from Switzerland, but no, I joined late, so I have no questions. Go ahead, Bill.
All right. Well, normally we get some feedback here. We've had some questions, discussion over in the chat that I could swing back to. The one was the questions around. All right. Well, first there was a.
Larry has his hand up, by the way.
Oh, Larry has his hand up. Fantastic. So Larry Strickling was the head of the NTIA and was fundamental in making the transition happen. So it would be great to hear from you, Larry, about how you see things with the perspective of 7 years.
Well, the good news is I've been encased in amber as far as ICANN's concerned since I left the government. So I don't really have any observations to make on the current state of ICANN. But there were a couple of points that came up that I thought I might contribute to. One was your question near the end about the ability to take this model and put it other places. We spent a lot of time thinking about that at NTIA, and then after I left government, I spent time thinking about that with the Internet Society. And I think the thing you run into all the time is the question of legitimacy of the process, of whatever process it is you're trying to create. And legitimacy comes in many forms. It affects who participates. Do you have a broad enough participation? More importantly, I think it depends on, do you have the people in the room who can actually implement the outcome? Otherwise, it's just an advisory body or a consulting body that comes together and thinks great thoughts and comes up with proposals, but they don't go anywhere because you don't have the people in the room that can actually take the outcome and implement it, which is why increasingly I had come to the view that the process still could work as a way to take on early stage policy questions where you might find, forward-thinking organizations, primarily corporations in the case of a lot of these policy issues, who might be willing to actually bring together a group of stakeholders, get a lot of viewpoints out, and then implement on an experimental or pilot basis some of these ideas as a way to help shape the eventual regulatory or legislative solution that might come. I mean, the problem we've always seen is that those solutions always come after too many years of debate. By the time they are affected, they're not solving the problem that exists at the time. So the question always was, how can you get more immediate thinking about this to solve the problem as it exists today? And I still think there's a lot of opportunity there for forward-thinking organizations and companies to take these ideas, engage stakeholders, and use them to help come up with broad principles and maybe some specific ideas as to how to approach a lot of these knotty policy questions that otherwise are going to be debated endlessly, but are never actually going to get solved. The other issue that I think I wanted to speak to is just the role of governments in ICANN. Keep in mind that in 2014 through 2016, during the period of this transition work, we were dealing with a very uncertain political landscape in the United States. I had one senator threaten to throw me in jail for what I was doing. We had people of certain political persuasions who said this was akin to the United States giving away the Panama Canal. So there was no way that this transition was going to survive politically unless it was going to be made clear to the constituents we had in the United States that this really wasn't a threat to the internet in the sense of governments taking over the internet. And I think that that was reflected in the provisions of the bylaws that were created with respect to the GAC, requiring not unanimity per se, but consensus, so at least nobody could object to it. We can argue whether that's the same thing as unanimity or not, but these were important issues that had to be worked through just to deal with the political realities we had with the United States, particularly the Republicans in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House that were trying to find ways to derail this. Folks may remember that we had to defend the transition at the last hour through a very significant preliminary injunction TRO hearing in Texas right at the last minute that was brought by some attorneys general of several states who were put up to it again by some of the more extreme members of Congress who wanted to try to block the thing. So that was a reality. And I think that how the community navigated those issues and came up with a solution that appears to have worked because in some sense, if governments aren't upset with what ICANN's doing and that's reflected in a lack of participation, I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I think I agree with Milton, who says that's probably an indicia of success of the transition. Thanks.
I do remember all the fun dynamics with Ted Cruz and others, and the posters saying that Obama administration wanted to give the internet to Kim Dae-jung. Those are fun times. We have another person who is centrally involved here as head of the board of directors of ICANN, Steve Crocker. Love to hear from you about this.
Thank you very much. I just want to make a very small comment. Milton said that ICANN was created out of thin air, and that there was. I think that's not exactly correct. In speaking about the accountability. By the time ICANN was created in 1998, we're talking about 30 plus years of actual experience developing the network, developing the communities around the network, developing the processes related to the expansion and inclusion of increasing fraction of the world's population. So there was quite a bit of mechanism and process that had been developed to say, and it was with that background that ICANN was created, and the formulation of the rules and the bylaws and the structure of ICANN. One can say, well, you took a blank piece of paper and just wrote down some rules. It's true only in the most superficial sense. There was an enormous amount of culture, enormous amount of experience, enormous amount of philosophy and thoughtfulness behind all of that. So I just wanted to try to set the context a little better. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Steve.
Could I respond to that? I don't want to get too involved, but in the ancient history. But the fact of the matter is, yes, there was 25 years of experience with developing the IETF, what became the IETF, and with John Postel coordinating essentially the protocol parameters and federal contractors. The problem was that so much of what this technical community built was informal. It was based on informal relationships. And so when it came time to make the really crucial policy decision about new top-level domains, John Postel discovered that he did not have the authority to tell NSI what to do, that he did not have legitimacy among the intellectual property community. They tried to create the GTLD MOU. And so there was just this period of 4 years between 94 and 98 in which there was essentially a huge power struggle over policy authority over the registries. And that's why we had to create ICANN. And then literally the whole idea behind ICANN was come at us with a new nonprofit organization and we will bless it. And then you'll have a new institution. And it took literally 15 years to get that institution the legitimacy, the predictability, the convergence of expectations that was required.
Okay. There's a comment in the chat, a question to you, Milton, but everybody can jump in on it from Siva, saying the technology employed to coordinate what we call the DNS may innovate, but the function performed by DNS will remain, expand, and embrace related spaces where identifiers are not so evolved, streamlined at the moment. This is what I meant by there cannot be deprecation of the DNS. I don't know if you have a response to that or.
I just say that remains to be seen. You know, I would as somebody who is both historical and not quite encased in amber like Larry, but been around for a while and seen technology evolve and have studied the history of technology, I would never say a particular system of identifiers will never be deprecated. I would just never say that.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that the DNS is not something that, you know, has been static for 20, 30 years. Like DNS as a protocol has evolved massively, and it needs to continue to do so, and it needs to continue to adopt new features and new use cases and new abilities for it to remain relevant. Like, yes, there is the element of, you know, technical legacy that it is there and therefore it will always be, but it needs to adopt and evolve like every other piece of technology.
So James, doesn't there seem though to be some kind of assumption in some circles among some internet people that the DNS is kind of static and old and not very terribly interesting?
It may be amongst those who are further away from the technical aspects of the DNS.
Mm-hmm.
Like the DNS is probably well over 100 RFC changes, you know, all of which are major feature additions or major changes to the DNS since its introduction. You know, like it's not a static protocol in any way, shape, or form. Right.
I would agree with that. Okay, so look, I think this has been an interesting discussion. We can move towards closure, but I mean, does anybody have any last synthesizing thoughts or bones to pick with each other or things they forgot to say that they'd like to throw out on the table just for takeaways from this conversation? Milton, you always have something.
No, I'm good. I think we've had a pretty
okay, well, we can, Olga, everybody, all good?
Yeah, I would like to react to a comment made by Larry. Hi, Larry, by the way, nice to see you virtually. I don't think I didn't say that it's a bad thing that governments are not participating that much or with a higher level representation from their officials. What I say is that I see less interest from different ministries or different parts of the government in participation. What it means at the daily work in the government is that there is less interest in the country, and this doesn't. It is not then externalized with other members of the government. So you know less about ICANN. So this idea about ICANN being fully United States organization may prevail. So what you can do with the governments involved is having the reality about how ICANN works, the multi-stakeholder government model of ICANN really working, is bringing that image to the country and to the government. So I see that it's better to have a higher involvement from government. I don't see it as a bad thing. What I would like to say about the structure is that I don't see a big evolution in terms of regional activity. I see that at large has this RALOS, which I think it's very good. I don't see that happening in other SOs and ACs, and I think that could be a good evolution. The GAC has no regions. After some struggles we had in like almost 10 years ago, now we have 5 vice chairs. They have 5 vice chairs that should somehow be related with regional representation, but not necessarily. So you may repeat regions if nobody is interested in being vice chair or chair. So that is something that ICANN could have in mind and try to enforce not only some staff representation at the regional level, but also some involvement regionally focused in the different communities.
Thanks, Olga. Okay, I just want to pick up two comments from the chat real quick, and then we'll close out. One was with regard to the point that you were making. I mean, James noted that the loss of tribal knowledge around ICANN within governments is a bit of a risk to be managed. And I think that this is one of the reasons why many of us years ago were arguing that there had to be more engagement by governments in ICANN, because otherwise the attention all goes by default into other settings where it's a completely different set of, I mean, I'm not at all surprised when I go to a UN meeting and people are telling me that ICANN is this evil American corporation that shouldn't have the responsibility it does, because those people are not engaged internally. They don't have the sense of what's really being done from the inside. So I think that's a problem. In any event, there was one other question though that I'm sure will sponsor or stimulate some response, which is that Larry asked to hear about Milton's book. And the invitation to Milton to talk about himself certainly cannot be passed up. So Milton.
Well, one of the goals of the book is to de-encase Larry from his amber. It opens up with this dramatic confrontation between Larry and Ted Cruz in the hearings. It really sort of says, what was this debate about? What does it mean to give up the IANA functions? What are the IANA functions? And so we have a historical chapter talking about the evolution of the IANA functions, and again, trying to precisely define what these functions are and how they affect policy, or what kinds of policies govern them. And then it's basically a historical account of how ICANN had to reach a certain level of development to achieve its independence from the US government, and then a few chapters about the post-transition issues that it faces. And this discussion has been very helpful in terms of adding some new ideas to that. It's about, I've written about 5 chapters and I expect it to be about 10 or 11. So I will finish writing it this year, and God knows how long the MIT press will take to actually put it together and publish it, but you should see it sometime in 2024, alas.
That would be fast for MIT press in my experience. By the way, Roberto put down his saxophone to say in the chat, one thing that's been touched on by a couple of speakers is, and has not been given much importance, is the fact that TLD issues, which are the primary source of debate and I would say revenue in ICANN, are slowly losing importance because of the way internet is being used is by other means. I don't know. So this kind of goes back to where I started about whether or not the ICANN and names and numbers are becoming sort of less interesting to a lot of people. So I think that's
just 2 cents on this. Literally one reply.
Good.
Yes, and even if volume is shifting, that volume is still shifting to services that run on unique identifiers, including the DNS, IP addresses, and protocol parameters. The fundamentals are still there. Shifting around where they sit on that doesn't really make a difference.
Exactly. I think that the DNS and IPs, I mean, it's just kind of descended into the background to become part of the fabric that we take for granted. And in a way, perhaps that's a success story, huh? So, okay, listen, this has been very interesting to me, at least. I hope it was to you. I thank you all for joining us. As I said, the next in this series of seminars will be a month from today on March 23rd. And we will be back to you with information on the topic to be discussed then. Thanks again, everyone, and
Thank you.
have a good one. Okay.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.